Hey everyone, my name is Madison Kleinfelter, and I get the pleasure of teaching you about symbiotic relationships between hydrothermal vent organisms and just exactly what hydrothermal vents are and why they're important. So just to get started off, what are hydrothermal vents? So hydrothermal vents are normally found on plate boundaries, typically convergent or divergent plate boundaries. So just to review, convergent is near subduction zones, just like the Marianas Trench. Divergent plate boundaries are where new crust is formed, typically just like the mid-ocean ridge. And some are also found along transform faults, which you'll see in the next figure. So in this figure you have obviously a world map, and as you can see, all of the red dots, let me get a highlighter. Here's a pen. So all of these are different types of vents. So in the red we have active zones, and in the yellow we have unconfirmed zones, and the different shapes indicate different places. So along a mid-ocean ridge they have the circles and arc volcanoes, which are typically with convergent zones, are found in the triangles, and back arc spreading centers, which are also convergent, are in squares. And I also have, what I really like about this figure is, so the solid lines are ridge and transform faults, and the trenches are found with these dotted lines here, if you can see that. So now that we know where they're formed, exactly how are they formed? So there's a more detailed figure in the next slide, but for just a general overview, they are heated by the Earth's mantle. It's when cold water seeps down, gets heated, and the high pressure and valuable metals and different chemicals become highly concentrated, shoot up, and they become a hydrothermal vent. So here is a really good figure. So as you can see here, water will seep down in here, and it'll get heated by the mantle. So this water, the open ocean water out here, starts at 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And as it gets down to this magma, which is 1,000 degrees Celsius, that's a near 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very, very hot, where absolutely nothing can live. It gets heated, and as it gets heated, it shoots back up, and it cools, and as it cools, it forms chimneys right here. And as it's coming out of the chimney, it's 350 degrees Celsius or 662 degrees Fahrenheit. And as it hits the very cold water that it's surrounded by, it precipitates, and all those valuable metals and minerals will precipitate out and fall right here, which is where we get a bunch of really good stuff that we can use. So last but not least, why is it important? What is so special about all of these? So they act as a natural plumbing system, and it can transport heat and chemicals from the interior of the Earth. This helps regulate global ocean chemistry, and this is also where minerals and metals can be extracted for consumer use. All right, so now that we know where hydrothermal vents are and how they're formed, let's go into a little bit what kinds of organisms are found there. So as of 2000, there were only 20 different types of organisms. Hydrothermal vents are relatively new, only discovered in 1977, and so only 20 different types of organisms were known. Originally, everyone thought that they were completely devoid of life, with such diverse conditions that hydrothermal vents provided. We didn't think anything lived there. So now we know that there's hundreds of different species that live around hydrothermal vents and often thrive there. A lot of them are microorganisms, worms, mollusks, fish, and different crustaceans. So since 1977, when we first discovered hydrothermal vents, at the East Pacific Rise, there have been 500 new species One is shown. A really, really cool octopi was found there. Often you wouldn't think that that would happen. So how do hydrothermal vents vary across the world, and how do organisms vary? It's actually really unknown, since these are so relatively new to scientists, and obviously it's not as easy to just walk up to it and study it. It does take a lot of money and a lot of time to get down to these hydrothermal vents and find different ways of studying what's there. So so it's not known how they're distributed throughout the world. There has been some research done that has shown different larvae from different organisms that are carried throughout currents that have been able to show last up for 38 days, but it's still relatively new, which is really cool that we can still expand on it. So why are these so uncommon, and why do, originally we didn't think a lot of organisms lived there. So some of the conditions, so it ranges from 400 to 750 degrees Celsius, right around the chimney. Obviously, as you get further away from the chimney, the temperature does decrease pretty rapidly. But 400 degrees Celsius is 750 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 750 degrees Celsius is 1,380 degrees Fahrenheit, which is extremely, very, very hot. So there's very high pressures as well, and also extremely acidic. Most of them have a pH value of under 3, which is very similar to vinegar, and often the vent hoods have been shown to be around 1 pH. So it's very, very acidic, hard for anything to live there, or so we thought. And it does consist of a lot of minerals, including calcium sulfate and different sulfides of copper, iron, and zinc, which we use a lot of today. So what are the problems? Obviously, you can see that the temperature and high pressures do cause a lot of problems for organisms to live there, and why we didn't think anything lived there. So most microbes and all eukaryotic cells can't survive at temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius because of the instability. It also causes instability with most enzymes and proteins, and they're often lost for their structures that they need, as well as the double helical structures for DNA, which obviously we can't live without. So there's a lot of variety in the metabolites that are also rapidly hydrolyzed, which means that these compounds are breaking down with the chemical reaction with water at about 90 degrees Celsius. So obviously these are a lot of problems. So how do these organisms cope with this? So a lot of them are extremophiles, so they live in very harsh conditions. It's not just at hydrothermal vents. You can also have organisms in either high salinity or high temperature, or also extremely low temperature. So these hydrothermal vent communities inhabit sulfide-rich habitats, and sulfide is very toxic to aerobic life forms, which are life forms that use oxygen, and very dense populations live there and flourish there, which is extremely interesting, and we originally didn't think that. So these organisms have evolved a way to detoxify them, and usually that is done by microbial symbionts, which I'll get into a little bit later. And a lot of these organisms that live around hydrothermal vents don't rely on sunlight and photosynthesis, such as like our plants and our primary producers that we depend on. So instead, bacteria and archaea, which are kind of like bacteria, but they are more ancient than bacteria. And they use a process called chemosynthesis to convert minerals and other chemicals in the water to energy. So these bacterium are the base of the vent community food web, such as like our plants and our primary producers that we depend on. So you heard me talk about symbionts that these organisms use. We finally got to it, the main topic of this presentation. So the hypothesized process of in which prokaryotes were given rise by endosymbiosis, which is one organism living inside another. So basically what they hypothesized was that a prokaryote engulfed another one, and the one that was engulfed was then given a different purpose, almost similar to multicellularity. So making different organelles. So this is how they hypothesized that mitochondria and chloroplasts were evolved. So they use these intracellular mutualists, which are the endosymbionts that live in different organisms, also different hosts that succeed in diverse places. And without these endosymbionts, they often wouldn't be able to survive or be able to cope with the different environments. So endosymbionts may be passed from parent to offspring, and they can also be obtained from the environment. It depends on the species. So not all endosymbionts are beneficial either. So parasites would be considered an endosymbiont because it's living inside of another organism. So it's not always beneficial, but for these organisms at the hydrothermal vents, they're extremely beneficial.
All right, so now on to the main topic of what we are going to talk about in this presentation, and this is the symbiotic relationships between tube worms with a scientific name of Raftia pectidila and bacteria. So the main part of these tube worms is the red plume that you can see right here. Point it out real quick. It's right here. And these are what they're commonly known for. And the reason that they're so red is the hemoglobin that's found in them, which binds very readily to oxygen, and the sulfide that's very present in the water that is surrounding them. So this blood transports these respiratory hemoglobins and the sulfide, and it takes them right to the symbiotic bacteria, which allows for the occurrence of chemoautotrophy for chemosynthesis. And colonies of this Raftia are anchored into rocks. So here you can see a cute little picture of one of the crabs, one of the organisms that live around hydrothermal vents on top of all of these tube worms. And lots of these tube worms, about thousands upon thousands of them, especially you'll see in the next picture, live on these vents. So they're anchored to the rocks or the precipitate that is coming out of these vents that forms the vents. And at the base of their tubes, the fluid is enriched with hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide and has virtually no oxygen. So they get their oxygen from the surrounding water instead of the fluids that are coming out of the vents. So this respiratory plume is extended into the water, which is where they get their oxygen. And this unusual microhabitat is the interface between the fluids of the hydrothermal vent and the bottom water, which are essential to both metabolites that are taken into the plume and transported to the bacteria. So here's the picture I was describing. Lots and lots of tube worms, thousands upon thousands of them in one vent, which is very cool. And so they live in this environment where there's a lot of sulfide, which is obviously toxic. So it's actually only been found to be in the soft sediment. It's not actually in the fluid that's around them. So how these worms get the sulfide in order to give to the bacteria, it's actually hypothesized that there's a thin extension of the tube that goes into the sediment. So rather than the plume, which is the red top of the tube worm, getting it, it actually appears that the sulfide transports through the body wall at the end of this tube. So here's a better picture of the inside of a tube worm, just very generic. So up here we have the plume, and that is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide and a lot of the microbes living inside the trophosome process the food. So what is the trophosome? So this is where all of the symbiotic bacteria lives, and it can live all throughout the tube here and as well in the plume. And so this is where the bacteria live. Here's a better picture of it. And as you can see, these capillaries, which is where the blood and the sulfur is transferred, is directly right next to all of the bacteria. And obviously, you have the trunk, and the extension would be shown under here, where they obtain all of the sulfur that's in the sediment. So tube worms are the main focus of what a lot of people use for endosymbiont, but there also are vent clams that obtain nutrition from sulfur oxidizing bacteria, and they're held in the gill tissues. And this is the same case for a lot of vent mussels, but the cool thing about the mussels is that they retained their ability to filter feed. So um, they not only have the bacteria living in their gills to give them energy through chemosynthesis, but they also have filter feeding so that they can pick up microbes from the surrounding environment. Okay, and last but not least, what happens after a vent dies? We have found that these things do not last forever, that sometimes they do come to a close. So, some of the causes that have led to vents dying. A whole paper that is in my Lit Cited that is named Geochemically Induced Shifts has found that iron oxidizing bacteria has actually overtaken vents and has overtaken the organism. So, as you recall, organisms use sulfur and not iron. So, we often think of iron as rusting, and it can also be very toxic to the organisms. So, they have found that, and they have also found a strong relationship between the geochemical energy and the organisms that use that energy. So, just for example, if the chemical makeup of the water were to change, extremophiles are not very good at adapting very quickly since they are so specialized to their already diverse environments. If that environment changes, they can't readily change either the chemical that they're taking up or the way that they're making that energy. So, some of the solutions that these organisms have found are a lot of microbes have actually been found to flourish after a vent dies. So, obviously, the iron oxidizing bacteria flourishes after these vents die. How that is known, they aren't very quite sure. A lot of research has gone into looking at that. And also, they've found that many organisms have evolved that mobile larva. So, they actually recorded, I'm pretty sure it was the tube worms, that the larva can last up to 38 days after they've been dispersed to find another vent or a more stable environment. And a lot of organisms in the marine environment use that mechanism in order to survive their species, pretty much. So, just some of the applications of these hydrothermal vents. So, they continue to redefine how and where organisms can survive, not only on Earth, but also extraterrestrially. So, a lot of scientists have been looking at understanding and expanding how these extremophiles survive, and not only on our planet, but where they might exist elsewhere, either in the solar system or beyond that. In addition, a lot of unknown enzymes, molecules, and metabolic processes discovered in the extremophiles and the organisms themselves offer a lot of potential for either biomedical or commercial applications that could be pretty valuable and also life-saving. Some of these include an enzyme from a vent microbe has been used to enhance the flow of oil extraction from deep reservoirs. So I kind of found this as a plus minus. If you enhance the flow, there could be a lot less damage to the surrounding environment. It's a lot less invasive, much easier to obtain since oil is such a high wanted material. So, but if it's more readily available and can flow a lot more, if an accident were to occur, such as like the Deep Horizon oil spill, it could be a lot more damaging to the environment. We saw just how effective that oil spill was, not just to that surrounding area, but pretty far from the oil spill. So that could be a plus or minus one. But just to end on an awesome note about hydrothermal vents. So they have found that an isonucleating protein found in these deep sea organisms is used to make ice cream. And everybody loves ice cream. So I hope that left a good impression on hydrothermal vents. And just quickly, here are my internet sources along with my published articles, which will be able to you'll be able to get those as soon as this is published. So I hope you learned a lot. Thanks.